And we're live. And hey, welcome to YUI Open Roundtable for May 8th, 2014. And today we have a special guest from Facebook, Pete Hunt, who's one of the core team members for React. And so also in this room today, we have Trip from YUI, and Carity and Eric from the Modown team, and Tilo too, of course. And so I guess today some of the things that we want to talk about is, well, let's first start off. So do you want to give us a quick intro on what React is?
Sure. So I'm Pete. I work on the React team at Facebook. Also work on the Instagram.com web product. And React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. That's what we call it anyway. Really what it is it's more like a declarative jQuery. So it's a way to manipulate the DOM in a more functional way. So rather than with a traditional approach where you say, hey, update this DOM node or set this value to this thing, you program it in more of an immediate mode. And what I mean by that is you say, hey, I'm going to express a function that describes my user interface at any point in time, the complete thing, and the system figures out how to update the DOM appropriately. So it's kind of like a server-rendered web app where, anytime the data changes, you hit the refresh button and you build an entire new page and you send it down to the browser, except we bring that to the client.
So it's basically just one-way data bindings from some of the things that you've mentioned before?
Sorry? I didn't quite get that.
Oh, sorry. Hang on a sec. So we also have two more folks from one of the Node platforms team over at Yahoo that just joined.
Cool.
And so with React, like one of the things that we've been experimenting with it is that it's the idea that you're able to both server render React as just a string, and at the same time you can use it to just wire out events without having to re-render the entire DOM. And so is that something that you guys are focused on right now? I think that's one of the core things that we really like about it.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that separates React from maybe like competing systems is that like we've built this from the ground up to be the way that we do all JavaScript moving forward at Facebook. I mean, this is going to power everything, and it's already powering a ton of stuff. So one of the things that is a requirement here is the library has to be like fairly small. So we're sitting at around 30K right now after gzip and minification, which is pretty good. It's also got to be really amenable to static analysis, so linting has to work really well. We're hoping to get like TypeScript support in a pretty major way in the future, so we can have some sort of type checking. Minifying with like Google Closure Compiler Advanced Mode is a big thing too. And another one of those things is that if we're going to be betting big on this system, it needs to be able to support server rendering, because some applications are more performant when they render on the server, others are more performant when they render on the client. And whatever system that we want to start moving towards needs to be flexible and support both of those modes. So it's really about flexibility and option value.
So one of the things that we've been working on is, so we're mostly like YUI users here, but we've tried to like start integrating like some React components into our existing like backbone like MVC framework, and so we've had a pretty easy time just like switching out like the view object inside of our MVC framework and just replacing it with a simple like React component that way. And so we were able to like reuse a lot of our just like data syncing there, all of our model structures, and that's something that we've really liked too.
That's awesome. That's exactly how we started using it on Instagram. We had a like backbone and mustache app, and we tried React on like this tiny little piece, this just small UI component, and it eventually like infected the rest of our application to the point where the entire page is a big React component app.
So one question I had around the server rendering side, are you guys actually doing this in production on anything?
So we had it in production at Instagram for a while. We ended up turning it off because basically we have this big like data center migration from EC2 to Facebook, and our ops team is really stretched thin. They just didn't want to maintain another service. And the great thing with server rendering is you just turn it off and like client rendering takes over. And so for the class of applications and the audience that Instagram has, Instagram is like a native mobile photo-centric site. So we actually have the luxury of having fairly high-powered modern browsers. So server rendering was less of a performance thing for us. So we never turned it back on at Instagram. At Facebook, we haven't rolled it out into production yet, but we will be imminently. We have a team working on this.
And then when you're doing this, are you using the exact same components running in Node.js on the server as you're running in the client, or are you decoupling them such that you're creating like a base, a core part of the component that's just like the render function, and then having the maybe some of the event handling code or whatever be some mix-in that only gets applied on the client, or is it just the same component?
The same components. So we move all of the browser-specific stuff into this. We have a lifecycle hook called component did mount, and that lifecycle hook is only ever called on the client. So we have like a rule in code review, which is if it's touching a browser API, it better be kicked off in did mount, and if you use it in render or in will mount, it's not going to work on the server.
And then if you were to put your components as, say, like ES6 modules or something like this, and then you had this dependency on some client-side only library, how do you end up dealing with that? Like, say you depended on like D3 or something, or some library that was like very client-side focused. What would you end up doing in that situation?
So your call site to something like D3 would be in did mount, but you're wondering like, okay, we don't want to like we don't want to like import D3 because it's going to crash in Node, right?
Yeah.
So this React doesn't is unopinionated about your packaging system. So this is more of like a how do you use React rather than how does React itself work. So there's a number of different approaches you can do. At Facebook, we have a way of saying, hey, this mod, like we use CommonJS for everything. And we have a way of saying, hey, this is the server version of this module, and this is the client version of this module. So for D3, the server version is like module.exports equals null. And that's the version we use in the server. And we just never call anything on it because we don't call it until did mount. Another approach you can do that we do in some places is you can have like conditionals that say there's a module inside in the internals of React called execution environment. And we say if execution environment dot can use DOM, then do this, otherwise do this other thing. So you can implement, you could create a wrapper module for D3 like that and put that in there, and then require it in only on the browser environment.
Okay.
The third approach that you can do is some sort of dependency injection thing, where you inject the D3 dependency at runtime. And however you do that, I think Angular has like a DI framework that's separable from the rest of Angular. It might be a good way to do it. I don't know. I don't really use DI too much in JavaScript.
Okay, cool.
So you guys use Browserify to bundle everything up in your case?
No. So we have a tool that does kind of the same thing. It takes a CommonJS dependency graph and then it bundles it for the browser. Facebook has had a very, very complex PHP-based bundling system since like 2007 that does all sorts of crazy stuff. Like it looks at the dependency graph and it looks at the production traffic from last week and it tries to compute the minimum deltas and all sorts of stuff like that. We couldn't reuse that for Instagram because it was just too tightly coupled with the way that Facebook does things, and Instagram is like an open source like Python project. Or it's built on like a lot of open source tools. Sorry, Instagram's not open source, but it's built on like Django and was running on EC2. So we looked at we started off with Require.js because I kind of didn't know what I was doing, and that was the most popular tool at the time, I think. And then we realized that its optimizer wasn't that great for the type of application we were doing, which has multiple entry points and lots of shared code between those entry points. So we want to, when you hit the photo page, we don't want you to download the profile page and the analytics tools and all sorts of other stuff when you don't need to. And we also, when you go from the profile page to the photo page, we don't want you to re-download React and everything else. So a tool like Browserify wouldn't work for us because it claims to support multiple bundles and async loading, but it doesn't do a great job of it.
Yeah.
So we ended up moving to this thing called Webpack, which one of its main features is like we'll look at your dependency graph, we'll look at your entry points, and we'll look at those parts where you can async load various modules, and we'll generate an efficient set of bundles for you, and we'll package your CSS and images and stuff with it. So that's worked really well for us on Instagram. But Facebook's got this way more advanced thing that's proprietary.
And then, yeah, that's stuff that we're pretty familiar with at Yahoo and with YUI and supporting those kind of loading strategies and yeah, we basically end up with the same thing. Although with YUI, the dependencies are computed on the client at runtime and figured out the bundling that way in terms of making like a big combo request. But I guess just one last question I had on the server rendering part. So when you guys had it enabled for like the head and HTML element and body, like writing out those chunks, like essentially everything but the main content or the main component, would you just use like Mustache or something like that to do that template?
Yeah, so we were Django shop, so we did we had a Django template that had the like doc type and stuff like that. So technically React does, you could make that part a React component. But because of like all these browser quirks, like you can't replace, like if you swap out the head tag in some browsers, they'll just like core dump. Like we saw that on some version of Safari on iOS. So we imposed like a bunch of like arbitrary limitations on this.
Sure.
So I actually, I wouldn't recommend it. And we have no way of expressing doc type in React.
Yeah. Okay.
So in general, yeah, like use a template system, and then maybe make your full page React component like the only child of body.
Sure. Okay.
That's what we do.
Cool.
So continuing on with like the server rendering thing. So server rendering has been like a really big thing for us since we've been working on Mojito and all of that since in the past. So we're wondering, like, do you think that's working with React and Node is something that's going to be more important in the future? Like, do you guys have a priority on making server rendering a first-class citizen in React, for instance?
So it already is a first-class citizen, and it's like it's never going away. It's fundamental to the design of React. So when you render a React component on the client, it generates a big string of HTML and inner HTMLs. And it does an inner HTML where you're putting the component. All the server rendering component does is it like returns that string rather than touching the DOM. So the only trick with it is making sure that we don't put any code on the initial render pass that touches a browser API. So like for example, we disable like we don't want to go through the event system when we server render. So we have like test coverage that runs React outside of the browser environment and makes sure that we can do that without touching the browser API. So this is like a firm requirement of the project. And we have a team of a couple of engineers working full time on getting this capability into production at Facebook. And getting services into production at Facebook, there's a lot of like interesting problems, but uninteresting from a React perspective. Like how much is all this going to cost? What types of boxes do we have to run it on? What are JavaScript environments going to be? That kind of thing. So most of the problems at this point aren't React specific. They're like ops kind of stuff.
And also,
I guess the only recommendation is, since it seems that you guys wanted to really push for it and get it out there as a first-class citizen, which I kind of today is really not, because we don't have feasible example that this thing is running good in production. So let's make sure that we have proper numbers in terms of performance. The way that things runs in the server is different from what it happens in the client, because you have a you have a process that is handling multiple users, multiple requests in the same process. So things get a little bit more messy on the server, and we have some experience with that. So, but the point is, we need to make sure that React works well on the server under under certain conditions, and we would like to see more on the things that React can do and the things that it cannot do on the server side. And I'm sure more things will come up in the future, but it seems that this is going to be critical for React to really fulfill the server side in the way that we want to use it.
There's a couple things that we're looking at. So one of the reasons we actually really like PHP is because it forks off a new process conceptually for every request, which means that there's a very low likelihood of user data leaking between requests because you don't have any of the data structures from the previous requests around. Now, with pretty much every other environment outside of CGI, they're all living in the same process with shared memory between requests. So one of the things we're looking at is, okay, how can we take Node, which is a single-threaded, where everything runs in the same, like basically runs against the same instances of the modules. How can we really be sure that we're sandboxing each request so that user data doesn't leak? So if you have like let's say you have some sort of global session object, you want to make sure that that's always cleared before the next request. So that's one kind of wrinkle around React. The other thing is that the thing that makes the magic behind the server rendering and why it is like relatively simple relative to other solutions is because your React components should be pure functions of the initial props. So you pass in a set of data into your React component, and you should render the exact same UI every single time. So there's a couple places where this can bite you. So if you're reading from the clock, for example, inside your render method, your clock's going to be different on the client and the server. So you need to make sure that you never read from the clock. Or if you're reading from the clock, you pass that clock value in as your initial props. So there's a couple things like that maybe some gotchas, the types of things that you're concerned about.
So in order to solve that problem, actually, we've been we've been using React to render it out onto the client as HTML, and at the same time, we include a sort of payload in the client.
Yeah.
Through express state, and that way we can rehydrate the entire React application on the client that way, and
exactly.
That way it'll be the exact same data. And since React knows that the virtual DOM is the same as the real DOM that's been rendered out, that's been something that's worked well for us.
Yeah, that's how it works with us. We have a little template helper in Django.
Yeah.
That's hey, give me this React component in this CommonJS module with this Python object of props, and it'll go to our Node render service, get the markup, put it in, and then also JSON serialize that data structure and queue up the.
And that's how we keep it insane too.
Yeah.
So with that, one of the things that we've also been trying to figure out is we want to use the same sort of a data synchronization service on both Node and inside the browser. So in that case, one of the things that we've been having trouble with is that since React's render method is almost synchronous, what's a good way of being able to, is there a good way that people have come up with sharing those data services so that, for example, it might use XHR in the browser, or it might use the request module on Node. But basically what's going to happen is that the API for those two data synchronization services are the same. Is there a good way of sharing them in both Node and in the browser?
There's again, React kind of sits at the jQuery level in terms of DOM manipulation. So there's a number of different ways you can do it. One way that's kind of the most straightforward way would be to treat React like a template engine. Mm-hmm. So you have some other system that does all your data fetching, throws it into the React component, and then the React component renders, and maybe some of those props are callbacks that React can then go back and ask for a refresh of the data or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is you can basically put static methods on your React component classes, and they'll basically be a function that takes in the route and then returns a promise that will give you the data that you need. Mm-hmm. And so you would have a tiny little framework sitting right outside of React. I'll call those static methods. They'll fetch all the data, and then you pass that data back in as props, right?
Yeah.
So that means you can render the components synchronously on the server, and then on the client, whenever you want to refresh the data, you just go to that static method from your component did mount or your event handler or whatever, and call it, and then the promise you just do like a set state, and you can get the data back in.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. I can like send a code example out if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. I've seen some people do some crazy things with fibers in the past with Node in order to set initial prompts that way, asynchronously. Yep. Like, that's something that might be a bit harder for us to do, but
yeah,
that's a creative solution. It really sketches me out, though.
Yeah.
I like the idea of just treating it as like similar to what you would do in Express or whatever, where you get all your data prepared, and then you just say, here it is, and you pass it into the top-level React component. Seems like that way is much more decoupled from trying to do any fetching inside of like at different points within your components.
Yeah, so I think that any system that we're going to come up with the current way that React works, if you want it to work with server rendering, it has to come in through the top at some point. Or it has to be synchronously available from, like, if you're side coupling it with some system. So really it's about how do I specify what data I need? What's the convention for describing what data I need to fetch? And so the thing that we've kind of thought about at Facebook is static methods on the component classes as a function of the route make a lot of sense. And how you wire those up is kind of, you know, I'd have to send a code sample because it's
send one at some point afterwards. That'd be good.
Sure.
So for touch-based devices and gestures, I know React has like support for tap, I believe, right? Like tap event, but does it go beyond that to include any other sort of gesture-based events? And is that something like planned, or would you recommend using like Hammer.js or some gesture-based library with React?
So there are people using Hammer.js. I haven't really used Hammer.js very much, so I don't know kind of like how good it is or what it does. I do know that like handling touch interactions is really hard because they're not usually discrete gestures. They're usually like these continuous things. Like you want it to stick to your thumb and then stop moving when you stop swiping. So partial swipes kind of like, you know, move back, that kind of thing. So I have a thing on GitHub called React Touch, which is like a little touch gesture library, and it's basically just React components that make high-performance animation a little bit easier, and wrap this great library called Zynga Scroller, which just does, it's a pure math component basically. You hand it touch events, and then it'll call you back on a tick, and it says, hey, set the position to this X, Y, and Z vector.
Okay.
And what that does is it implements kind of the iOS scroll physics and snapping behavior and all that like great stuff. And so that's felt really good, the experiments that I've done with that. Cool. At least on iOS 7.
So another question about data, and this is something that actually we have been looking into in the last few weeks, is related with the fact that sometimes we have data that is that should be or is available at the app level, like saying the language in which your application runs. And more than that, not only the language, but maybe some formats for the numbers or dates and stuff like that. Like saying I want to have a custom format for all the dates that I will use, aside from the internationalization part of it, which is transforming that into the proper output in terms of dates and numbers. We have this case where we have the local data or the language in which the application runs and some other information associated with that, and we want that to be available for all React components that are supposed to be implementing internationalization. Saying if I have a React component that has a render method, and in that render method I need to know the language of the page, and I also need to know some of these formatters that allow me to render things correctly. How can I have that information available across the board without having to pass this from one component to another when I define the dependency between them, because that's going to be more complicated. Like saying, oh, I need to go back and change my whole application just to support internationalization, rather than saying you have to change the component that needs that to support internationalization. And the question comes because of we have been using other templates engines like Handlebars, in which case we have the data the data layer that Handlebars provides, which is a parallel layer with the specific object that you pass into the Handlebars component, but it actually allows you to pass that all the way down to all the partials and all the sub-components.
Yeah, so this is something that comes up a lot. So let me just, for your specific case, which is localization, is what you're talking about, like formatting numbers. The problem here is that every single time that you want to add one of these, dare I say, cross-cutting concerns that like kind of affect everything, you have to like pass this like thing. You have to thread this parameter through every single layer of components, right? So for this particular case on Facebook, we just do it with globals. We say, hey, this is a global environment thing. So the localization system is separate from React, and we have a localization component that wraps our other localization system, and we just call into that. So we effectively, are just using globals and delegating to this singleton location thing.
But in the case of global, how does that work on the server side? When you run
well, yeah, that's the thing, right? Is if you're handling multiple requests, you need to be able to figure out which one is that, which one corresponds to your environment. So yeah, that's hard. So we have an undocumented feature which does exactly what you want, and it's a feature called context. And what it literally is it lets you implicitly basically pass a prop throughout your entire application, and then you can shadow it as well. So you can say, hey, here's I'm going to pass my localization service in as a prop, or as a context thing. And then, somewhere down the tree you can say, actually, I want to replace the localization service with this other one. And so we use that for handling, for like passing the route around. So like everybody wants to look at the route and the currently logged in user. So we pass those around this context thing. Now, the reason that this is undocumented, and the reason why we haven't like published this and talked about how awesome it is because there's this fundamental it breaks encapsulation, right? And so if a component like deeply nested in your tree depends on a component higher up in the tree providing that localization service. So it's we think that if people start using this for everything, like it's going to make things really brittle, and there's this trade-off between how much typing do you want to do in refactoring versus how reusable and safe do you want your components to be. So this feature is in there, and you can read about it. I think we might have a wiki page about it, but it's not in the official docs.
But I guess in this case, if you knew you were writing your components only for this one particular app, then you may feel better about using this feature. But if you know you were creating this component to make it reusable in many different apps or something, then you probably don't want to do that, is what you're saying?
Well, we actually ended up doing something similar to what you described. Like we ended up having a mixin that you can mix into your component, and this mixin has a method that you can call, and this method will try to find out the closest owner that has internationalization information, picking up that from there and giving it to you.
I wrote that mixin 2 years ago when we first started using React on Instagram, and we eventually turned it into a core feature called context, and it's
perfect.
Context is going to be a little bit more efficient. There are a couple of gotchas though. So there's this should component update method, and this is another reason why it's not like a public stable like we're proud of it API. There's this should component update method which lets you kind of block updates to parts of your subtree for performance reasons. If you're implicitly passing this data through this component, it has no way of comparing, the previous, location service with the changed location service and deciding whether it should block that update or not. So if the things that you have in your context are static and they never change, it works just fine. But we don't really have a great composition story yet around this. We're going to probably have to have context. Every time you register a value inside of context, you have to register some kind of like should context update hook.
Okay.
This is something that we're still thinking about.
So
do
does
you
it
make
like triple equals now? Is that, and then if it doesn't triple equals, then it says it must update? Is that what happens now?
It just completely ignores context right now.
Oh, okay.
So you actually, in your should component update, you can look at the context, but you don't know like what you should look at, right? Like you have no idea what keys should be in there. So it's just going to be a little bit ad hoc right now. But I don't think, for the types of applications that you use context for, like route, like the only thing I can think of that changes really is the route, and that's usually not like a super performance sensitive thing. So I don't know. Like we still have to build more applications with it. We have some stuff in production that uses it, so it works. It's just we don't have the best practices well formed yet.
Yeah. So you mentioned that subcomponents will be able to modify that context. What happened when someone tried to modify that context down the road?
We've tried to make it as explicit as possible, so you can only basically like shadow the context. So like a component down in the hierarchy can't change the context above it. It can only say, hey, okay, like I want to change the viewer for this subtree, but it won't affect the viewer anywhere else. And in order to like minimize the damage of this break in the encapsulation, you have to explicitly list off in your class definition, like, these are the context keys that I'm providing, and then the thing down there explicitly lists off, here are the context keys I'm using. So even if you can't statically analyze that, you can at least grep for, like, what components are interacting with each other. Now, I know Sebastian on the team has some crazy ideas around, like, getting this to be fully type-checked in TypeScript, but I can't speak to how that'll work.
Yeah, because we have this case where at some point we might have a section of the page that has a different configuration, and we wanted to render something in different language or something like that. So that portion of the page might control the language for that portion rather than the language of the whole page, which is different. Crazy use cases again, but we want to make sure that we can solve those as well for the new component that we are creating, which is a React Intel, to support internationalization the same way that we do it for DOS and Handlebars and other engines.
Yeah, we have this mind-bending, it's mind-bending like for engineers, this feature where you can look at you can look at your own timeline from somebody else's perspective. So like if you have stuff on your timeline that you don't want like your boss to see or something, I don't know, you can say, how does this look like? And you type in your boss's name, and then it'll show you your timeline from your boss's perspective. So at that point, like, there's two notions of viewers, right? There's like the real viewer and the like viewer that we're using to render the timeline. And so what we'll do is we'll show like the top nav bar. We'll have your your avatar, the real viewer, and then we'll set context on the timeline, and we'll say, no, the viewer is actually your boss. It's more complicated than that, but like that's the type, like, we recognize those use cases.
Yep. All right. Perfect.
I've always wondered how you guys did that.
Yeah, with lots of unit tests, that's how we do it.
Yeah, I mean,
well, let's make sure that you guys document the context.
Yeah.
To begin with.
Sorry, I think I just missed that.
Let's make sure that you guys could document the context.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that like we're gonna document it eventually because it's gonna be a feature. It might change a little bit. It's not gonna fundamentally change, but parts of it might change. And it's just like really dangerous. Like the community is still pretty young at this point, and people are used to these like template systems that just kind of like allow you past, like, they don't really value encapsulation so much. So like a good example is like the default scoping for Angular directives is like the one that like just constantly does prototypical inheritance all the way down. And so we're concerned that like there's going to be this ecosystem of components that pop up that aren't truly reusable. So that's why we're keeping it undocumented, because the API is in flux, and we want to make sure that we hammer the best practices of encapsulation really hard.
Do you guys have any plans on like getting this to work with the web components standard that's emerging? Like, are you guys planning on having something that might follow better with that standard, or are you going to just keep React components as they are right now?
So we've been talking a lot with the web platform guys at Google who are driving a lot of the web component stuff. I think there's Viju, who's on our team, and then somebody in open source built web components wrappers for React components. So you can basically create, you can instantiate a React component from a web component, and then there's a React component that wraps a web component. So you can kind of Russian doll them together. So that's a pretty good interop layer. We've been talking with the people working on these standards, and to be honest, we're not thrilled with a lot of the web component standards. They go kind of against a lot of the things that we believe in. So we believe in being divorced from the DOM rather than betting harder on the DOM. And like a lot of web component standards are about, like the template tag and custom elements and shadow DOM. Like you can't server render shadow DOM, right? So at least not right now. And so that's kind of a deal breaker for us. But fortunately, through our discussions with these teams, it looks like there are going to be some standards coming out, like the box tree API, that we're really excited about. And so for the past maybe month or two, there's been like a really great back and forth dialogue, and we're starting to see a lot of progress. And they're kind of seeing our perspective, and we're seeing their perspective. And it's kind of this ideological difference, right? I like to think of it as, is the browser Visual Basic, or is it libc? React treats it as libc. We treat it as this like rendering engine at the end of the wire. Web Components treats it as a full development environment. It's just ideology.
So any of you guys here have any questions?
Yeah. One of the big things that we were running into as we were trying to rebuild some internal components.
Could you guys just move the mic a little closer, because we can't hear here on the Hangout.
Yeah, so one of the problems that I guess we were running into that we were, so it basically has to do with communication between components and that might be arbitrarily nested. So something like, if you were to build a backbone app, you'd be able to use like custom events and then have a listener of like the parent event to catch that. Is there, I guess, how would that work with React?
So yeah, this is another thing that comes up a lot. And if we're weak on anything, it's best practices docs and examples of bigger systems. So the way that I like to think of it is coarse-grained change tracking. So when you start and sit down and build a single React component, it makes a lot of sense, right? You pass in parameters, it renders, it has some internal state that it updates itself. But when you start building a bigger system where you've got the news feed needs to update when the like count on the photo changes, and the photo viewer needs to update when the like count on the photo changes, it starts to really tightly couple all of your various components together. So the system that we have at Facebook for handling that is called Flux, and we put out a talk on it, and we have an example of it in the repo. But at the end of the day, it's just like basically a global event system where or a couple of event emitters that are singletons. And you can say, hey, I'm going to subscribe to changes in photo ID 123. So rather than passing this entire photo object through all the time, your newsfeed component instantiates a feed store of photo ID 123, and then that goes to this event emitter and registers for changes on that. So the advantage here is your components are reusable, and you don't have to re-render like the entire page on every change. But it is a little bit of extra glue code. The hierarchical data flow React has solves a lot of what we think are the complex edge cases, but for bigger, kind of coarser things, traditional models or observable models work pretty well.
Let's see.
And so in that event system that you guys talk about in Flux, is it correct that you recommend using custom events that bubble up through the actual DOM nodes?
No.
No?
A lot of systems are bubbling events through the DOM. Like Flight does this, and this is a feature request like, I don't know, every day on our mailing list or something. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. There aren't a lot of other UI toolkits that do bubbling at all. And bubbling is kind of like, I think it was designed for hit testing mostly in the browser, right? Like you don't know whether you're clicking on the inner div or the outer div, so it like bubbles it up. But for logical events, when you're building with components, does it make sense for your feed component to have the photo-like event bubble through it? It's another thing where it breaks encapsulation. So for the types of events we were just saying, these are not events on the React components. These are the components themselves subscribing to events in the data model. And then they're calling set state on themselves as a result of that event. For other events, for communication between like child and parent in a React component, those will not bubble by default. I mean, browser events will, like clicks and stuff like that will, because you want it to work like the browser. But it doesn't really make sense for like these logical user-defined events to bubble through, and it just increases coupling, right? Because if you capture, or if you listen to, some logical event higher up in the hierarchy, and then you change the implementation of some component lower in the hierarchy such that that event isn't emitted anymore, your app is going to break subtly.
And then so to communicate user interactions outside of a component, is it just recommended through to like pass through a function through the props all the way down, and then just call that handler or call that function to communicate that data upstream, or was there some part of like the Flux architecture that also uses the event system to dispatch that like out to the global dispatcher?
This is it depends on the event you're talking about. So for example, just off the top of my head, like a menu open event, that shouldn't be global, right? Like that's just, you're telling your parent that the menu opened and it can do something. And if you have to handle that menu open event, it probably makes sense for you to do the extra typing and manually pass it down, because it's not being passed down that far, and it's truly the public interface to that component.
Sure.
But if this is a photo-like event, a very kind of high-level data model manipulation, that makes sense to drop it into the global queue and put it into the Flux architecture. So really, it's looking at it on a case-by-case basis and trading off. It's so easy to reason about event handlers being passed in as props, but it's a lot more typing, and you got to balance that encapsulation and the coupling.
So there's a question on the chat. William asks, can we get a link to the Flux example? I've been looking all over and I haven't been able to find it and would love to learn more.
So that's in the Facebook React GitHub repo, and there's an examples folder, and then there's one that's...
Is the to-do MVC example?
It's to-do MVC Flux, yeah.
Okay, yep, Frankie just posted that.
Okay, great.
And GitHub is the way in which the project operates. Is it source of truth there yet?
It depends on what you mean by source of truth. That's where, if you file an issue there or send a pull request, that's where it gets merged and handled and all that. We have this discussion is mostly on Google Groups.
Okay.
Open sourcing a JavaScript framework that a big company like Facebook is using in production in real time has its own unique set of challenges. So we have a little bit of syncing that we do between the GitHub repo and the Facebook repo. So when you say source of truth, it's like, is the Facebook repo the source of truth or GitHub? It's a little ambiguous, but we have a system in place that makes syncing reliable. So.
And is there like a regular release schedule that you guys are under yet, or is it more feature-based?
It's historically been feature-based. We want to move towards like a train leaving the station model.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've been wondering about is there if we might want to start like helping out and contributing back to React, do you guys have like a roadmap of what things might be higher priority for you guys to solve during like a certain sprint or anything like that?
Yeah, we have a GitHub page, a wiki page on GitHub called, I think, Roadmap, and and there was a blog post called The Road to 1.0. And so there's a big list of things there, most of which we've already done. There's a couple that are left. There are things as simple or as well defined as make descriptors immutable, right? Like that's pretty clear. The things that you return from render should be immutable objects. And then there are things that are like very, very hand wavy, like solve animation or figure out layout. I think that those may get cut from the 1.0 target because they're so broad. But yeah, if you go in there or file an issue if some things aren't clear.
Okay.
I guess the release manager for Instagram just pinged me on IRC. I guess he's watching. So ask Paul O'Shaughnessy.
Hi. All right. Anyone else on the Hangout have any other questions?
I do have a question about events. I've been playing a lot with touch events, and I noticed there is like some delay between touch start and touch end, even if you touch like really fast. So is there some kind of buffer going on? And also there is a second issue that is sometimes is actually more performant if you bind, instead of binding to the document, you bind to the element itself with touch events. So is there any API that I can avoid binding touch events directly to the document?
Sure. Answer to the first question is I don't know. I haven't, there shouldn't be a buffer between the events. Being like, the buffer is the set states get buffered up and then the render gets flushed. I don't think the events get buffered. So I'll have to dig into that. I don't know the answer for you. The second question was, most events in React are attached at the document or the window. And then we have some events that are attached on the per node basis. And it's recently come to our attention that attaching like scroll, for example, is another one of these events that pulls the scrollable content off of the GPU and into software. And so yeah, one of the things that we want to do is get to a point where we can attach those to the nodes themselves. That is actually probably something that an external contributor could do because we already have precedent for it. So our image on load event, for example, we do it on a per node basis. So and we recently, well, fairly recently, redesigned our event system to be a little bit more friendly to external contributors. So yeah, you can hit me up in IRC. I'd be happy to show you where to start. And someone here might actually be working on that. I'm not sure. So I'd check for that as well. Because we've definitely observed that.
Another thing I was thinking about was about the immutability of the components. I've been playing with push state. So what I'm doing is I created a very simple mixin that has tries to store the state of whatever component is using this mixin, and then I restore it when back button is pressed. But when I mix that with server-side rendering, I get some funny stuff because then I get all the props coming from the server. They're already bound because of my model is the same in the server and on the client. And what happens is when I'm using the development version of React, I get this alert saying it's not possible to remount the exact same. I think the diff is different because now I'm restoring the state on the component will mount.
Yep.
So do you have any recommendations regarding that? Because it seems like a bottleneck for performance.
So yeah, what React is basically saying is hey, you rendered a different thing on the server than you're going to render on the client. So I'm going to blow away all that DOM and regenerate it on the client, which kind of sucks. So the easiest thing you can do is like don't render that initial don't pull the state out of push state until after you've rendered. Do it in component did mount and then call set state. So then you will get the server rendering with a server rendered page, and then it'll pop in the content saved on the browser. So this is what I do for like local storage. We have a development mode where you can like persist your component state to local storage for testing. That's what I do.
But then I get the page flashing because of that, right?
Yes.
I flash the previous stage, and that's like really awkward for the user.
Well, I mean, you don't have this data on the server, though, right?
Yeah, I don't, but the server doesn't know it's a back button action. So I pre-render like as the initial stage. So let's say I have tabs. One of the issues is with tabs. So the server sends the first tab as active, but I know for a fact that the user wants to go back to the second tab because of the state that is on the push state, right? Mm-hmm. So I want it, and in this case it's just a class difference, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't want the whole DOM to be blown up and rebuild. I don't know if we have a solution for that.
You either need to sync your state on the client with the state on the server, so it renders the same thing. Another thing you could do is you could say, hey, this part of the page, only here, we want to only render it on the client. So what you can do is you can like have your render method return a div, and then on did mount you can say this.setState like rendered equals true, and then it'll update and then render that. So you can, I mean, that's like kind of a cheeseball thing to do, but it'll, you know. Like
and I would recommend not using the state part of push state and instead using the state in the URL, because you will save yourself tons of pain.
Yeah, if you can make it a pure function of the route, that's the idea. It's like you need something that you have on the server and the client.
So he brought up another good issue though about this idea of having to render just go through the process of rendering everything. So like if you have your entire page is built of a lot of React components, and then you have like one little data property changing, and you need to pass that all the way down. Is it still like performant enough to do that, or do you recommend like short-circuiting the entire render process and going in at a different entry point, like some subtree part, and only rendering that subtree? Or do you guys still recommend like always passing it in from the top and going straight down and creating essentially the intermediate data structure for everything?
For Instagram, we pass everything in from the top because our data model is pretty simple. For Facebook, we tend to do a lot of side coupling. So we'll pass like IDs through the tree, and then we'll do that Flux subscription to the data stores. And the subscription thing is nice because it only re-renders from the place where it's used.
I see.
If you ask David Nolan, the closure script guy, because they have these great immutable data structures, they just render from the top every time, and it's efficient. Because you know they just do these pointer comparisons for like login times down the tree.
Okay.
So speaking of closure script, we have a question from IRC. Like, do you guys think that people will you guys work on maybe using like persistent data structures inside of React to try to capture some of the things that they've been doing in without closure script?
I mean, it seems like using persistent data structures outside of React is getting people pretty far. We don't want to limit the people that can use React to only people that know how to use these persistent data structures. So I'm not sure that we're ready to take a hard dependency on that at this time.
All right, cool. Anyone have any other questions for now? All right. Anyway, Pete, thanks for coming. We really appreciate you coming and chat with us. It's definitely been awesome. So.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having me on here. It's a lot of fun to talk about this stuff, not in like a blog post or conference setting. Like the back and forth is really great because we don't get the opportunity to talk about server rendering that much too. So this was awesome.
Yeah, and that's something that's still going to be like a big focus for us. So you might see some contributions for us there in the future.
Yeah, when I went to Yahoo, I felt like we were both speaking the same language. Like you guys have the same problems we have at Facebook. So it's great to be among like-minded people.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for taking all of our questions. It's just letting us parade you with questions, and
Sure.
it's been really helpful.
I'm Pete at Instagram.com if you need any other support.
Cool.
Cool. There were a lot of people tuning in, so I just wanted to let everyone know that if you wanna, the video will be up on YouTube, on the YUI Library YouTube account. So if you need to refer to any of these things, you can just go there later, and it'll be there.
Awesome.
All right. Awesome. Cool.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so much, guys.
All right, bye.
Thanks, guys.
Coming out.
See you soon.